Good morning. As you heard, I'm Bruce Dowton, the Vice-Chancellor and President of Macquarie University, and I'm very privileged to hold that role, leading this incredible young and dynamic institution of Australian higher education. As I've developed leadership roles over my career in several countries and across many cultures, I've had the opportunity to reflect on what it takes to be a leader. How does one learn to be a leader? And in thinking about that, you will have also heard just a moment ago that I am a paediatric physician and geneticist by training. I've taken care of children with inherited and congenital disorders that are often quite complex, and I can assure you that on balance, it was not a particularly good thing to be a child in my practice, in my clinic. Genetic illnesses are often devastating to the lives of children and families. So I've mused over whether I am first a physician and then a leader, or how these two aspects of my life are intertwined. And I want to share with you some reflections upon that here today. The eminent Harvard education professor Howard Gardner some years ago reflected that leaders are about telling stories, the exposition of stories to inform and help their organizations move forward in the context that they find themselves. So as part of my thoughts for you today, I'm going to share with you a couple of stories that I hope will give you a sense of how, at least in my conception of leadership, I link the professional being I am as first a pediatric physician and then a leader, and how those lives are intertwined. So, a model of leadership I've thought about is where leaders are about four things. First, leaders are about helping their organizations to build, create, and sustain identity. Second, leaders are about making connections within their organization and beyond their organization. Thirdly, leaders are about interpreting complexity for their organization, helping the organization to understand where it fits into a modern and forward-looking context. And fourthly, leaders are about modeling ethical behavior and the values of the organization. So this setting is 1980, the city is Sydney, the hospital is Concord Hospital. The protagonists in this story are a senior hematologic physician, a young, impressionable, green intern, and Olwen, a wonderful elderly lady with a lilting Welsh accent, who had for some years before been diagnosed as having an indolent leukemia, a slow malignancy that would progress over time, but eventually it would escalate and she would need more treatment, more regularly, more aggressively. She was admitted to the hospital many times, largely for blood transfusions, red cells, white cells, platelets, as the tumor cells invaded her bone marrow and consumed the blood-producing part of her body. The frequency of her hospitalizations was escalating and she was getting concerned. So the setting is on the ward. She'd been in for another transfusion. The senior hematologist on rounds explains to her where she's up to and mentions to her as he leaves the room that she can expect to be back in about a week to 10 days for the same thing all over again. More tests, more sticking, more poking, more blood transfusions, day and a half in the hospital. The intern thought, she doesn't seem herself. He'd met her once before in a prior hospitalization. Doesn't seem herself. So at the end of the day, the intern went back in the evening time and sat on the side of the bed and said, "Are you okay? How are you?" And Olwen said, "I'm tired. I'm tired. I've lived a good life. I don't want to go through this again. I want to be at home. I want to be with my neighbours." She had no family. "I want to be with Barney, her Scottish Terrier dog. I don't want to do this again. As I've reflected back on that, I've thought, what a poignant story of personal identity. Someone who actually is in a resolved way, calm, thoughtful, purposeful about her identity as a human being, claiming her life the way she wanted to be. I've thought about that in terms of all organizations. Leaders are about helping their organizations to build, create, and sustain identity. I mentioned before my thesis that leaders are also about making connections. Clearly, as a pediatric physician taking care of children with very complex illnesses, I was often called upon to make referrals, to have children with multiple congenital abnormalities see a host of different consulting physicians, orthopedists, cardiologists, ophthalmologists, ENT doctors, and so on. So I could see very quickly that that function of making connections was very important to those patients, in the same way as I believe leaders are very important about making connections within their organizations and far beyond. So leaders are about identity, leaders are about making connections. I mentioned earlier too that leaders are about interpreting complexity. The setting now is the late 1980s in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was a young consultant in clinical genetic practice, taking care of a variety of children, and became involved over some time with the family of Jonathan. The protagonist, Jonathan, his wonderful devoted parents, and his grandparents on both sides. Jonathan had the condition cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is an inherited condition which, among other things, causes significant problems with digestion, where a young child with cystic fibrosis cannot digest their food because they don't produce enough enzymes from their pancreas, and they fail to thrive, fail to grow. They also have significant risk for lung disease, recurrent pneumonia, often spending lots of time in and out of the hospital for treatment of pneumonia. There are other aspects of cystic fibrosis as well. Today, it's a much more effectively treatable disease than it was back then. Modern treatments extend the lifetime of these children today well into adulthood, but that was not always the circumstance for a severe case of cystic fibrosis back then. At its biological level, cystic fibrosis is a disease of chloride transport. Chloride ions do not move across cell membranes effectively in children with cystic fibrosis, the fundamental biological illness. And in fact, physicians have known about that for a long while, because diagnosis of cystic fibrosis is made by measuring the concentration of chloride or sodium chloride in sweat. And long before lab tests came, cystic fibrosis could be diagnosed by licking the skin of a patient and tasting very salty sweat. Jonathan had a bowel blockage at birth, which is characteristic of cystic fibrosis. Successful surgery, did well for the first couple of years of life with treatment for his intestinal problems. He then started to get pneumonia. He was in and out of the hospital a number of times, and I'd met the family in a collateral way and became quite close to them. Increasingly needing to be hospitalized. And then one time, often hospitalization would be for a week or 10 days to help the lungs improve so that the child could be discharged. Predicted to be a normal course of hospitalization. Unfortunately, this time, things didn't quite go to plan. And Jonathan, about halfway through the planned 10-day hospitalization, became increasingly sick on the ward, had to be moved to an intensive care unit. Lots of things started to go awry. On ventilatory support, on life support systems, and ultimately he succumbed to his illness at a young age of 6. And as I saw the family back, I reflected upon they'd had lots of doctors talking to them, always, and particularly in the intensive situation of that last few days of his life, giving them information, interpreting what was going on, trying to make sense out of the complexity that was very real in his life. And they were certainly meeting with the doctors and team every few hours, through day and night, sleeping on and off, grandparents in and out with the parents. And it was turmoil, lots of complexity. And I saw them back in my office about 6 weeks after he had lost his life. And I thought to myself, what can I possibly say that can help the grief of these wonderful parents, to try to make some sense out of what had happened? And I decided that I could say a few things I would typically say, but I also had in my file a wonderful poem written by a physician in the late 1950s who himself had lost a child to cystic fibrosis. And so I gave them this poem, and I share a little bit of it with you. Remembering that children with cystic fibrosis have a problem with salt, with chloride transport. I stole you from your quilted bed and carried you to the shore, just as the sun siphoned the tide into foghorn misted sky. We built a fortress there with our bucket and 2 spades, for we were safe behind the walls, secured in our sound castle, from foes we had imagined and foes within our genes. And I kissed you on your pallid cheek, and for one brief happy moment, the salt I tasted on my lips was sweet and from the ocean. But when I held your trembling hand, when we were homeward bound, the bitter brine upon my tongue was from the tears I cried, for I knew, much more than you, that the tide was coming in. Several weeks after that, in my mail, I had a letter from Jonathan's grandfather, who was a lawyer. And he thanked me for my attention to his son and daughter-in-law during Jonathan's life. He particularly made note and thanked me for what I had done by giving them this poem. And he wrote to me and said, "You have helped them see simplicity out of the awful complexity of Jonathan's illness. That ultimately, despite all of what he would go through and had gone through, the tide would turn. You helped them understand complexity in a simple way." So my thesis is also that leaders are called upon to help interpret the complexity of their organizations, to show the people they work with a pathway through that complexity and help them make sense out of it. Not always the sense they want, not always the sense they expect, but that in some way might bring together the community of an organization to really understand what might be going forward. So leadership, in my view, is about helping create and build identity. It is about making linkages. It is about interpreting complexity. And it is about also living a life which models ethical behavior and stays true to the values of what an organization is all about. On that last one, if you pause for a moment and we think, for medical people, for physicians like myself, particularly physicians who care for patients with devastating illnesses, there are legion opportunities where we are called upon to think carefully about the decisions we make, about how we go forward. So leadership about those 4 things. But for me, the connection point between my life as a physician and my life as a leader is about the stories out of all of my life that I reflect upon deeply. And as I close, I come to the words of Francis Thompson, who, writing about his Christian deity in a wonderful poem, The Hound of Heaven, speaks powerfully to me about this fundamental need for reflection. Francis Thompson: "I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of mine own mind and in the mist of tears. I hid from him, and on a running laughter, up vistaed hopes I sped, and shot precipitated. Adown titanic glooms of chasm fears, from those strong feet, and followed after, with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace. Deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat, and a voice beat more instant than the feet. All things betray thee, who betrayest me. So my thesis in that model of leadership is that reflection comes down to, if we betray ourselves and knowing who we are and who we are not as an individual in all of our life, we cannot be effective as leaders. These are my thoughts. Thank you. Thank you.